This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I'm so delighted to have Dr. Knut Witkowski with us. Thank you, sir. Witkowski with us. His background is as follows. He holds an MA in biostatistics. He's a Doctor of Science and Biometry. He was a former head of research, design, and biostatistics at Rockefeller Foundation. He formerly headed the College of Epidemiology, means incidence, distribution, and control diseases and other factors related to health. What is the difference between an epidemiologist and a biologist? Is a biologist and an immunologist the same thing?
No, not at all. And now I have to apologize a bit to all virologists because I will simplify a bit. A virologist studies the structure of a virus and how that virus interacts with human cells. An epidemiologist studies how a virus spreads in the population, how long and how wide, and when the spread stops. So these are two very different things.
How do we know if an outbreak is serious or not, or if it's simply a rush to judgment?
Well, the disease is a serious disease, like many flus are. Every year we have 25 to 65,000 people dying of the flu in the United States. So infectious diseases, respiratory virus diseases, are severe diseases that need to be taken looked at carefully.
How do we know, did the lockdowns and social distancing help or hinder? Why or why not?
We have never done a lockdown before. We have, as epidemiologists, always advocated that if there is a limited outbreak somewhere, that we can isolate that particular place. And this is what China had done in Wuhan, and quite successfully so. And we try to isolate and protect the vulnerable. So that is something South Korea had done very successfully. They had closed the nursing homes for the elderly and thrown the keys away. So nobody was allowed to get in or out. And that was initially extremely successful in South Korea.
Should this be true of all viral outbreaks? Should all viral outbreaks be managed the way you described?
Well, all respiratory virus disease are spreading very similarly because they have to infect you in the nose and in your lung. And then we have the normal incubation time that lasts about 5 days for all infectious diseases. That is how long our immune system needs to make antibodies. And then the immune system kills all infected cells, and this gives us the phenotype, the disease. So we are not really getting ill from the virus. We're getting from the immune system, ill from the immune system, killing all infected cells. That creates a huge wound. And if you have a problem with wound healing, like people with diabetes have, then you have a problem. And then this is why people with these comorbidities are at a high risk of dying.
Problem with wound healing. That's the key word. Who are usually the most vulnerable in any outbreak of disease and why? Well, you just told me why. Who are usually the most vulnerable? Okay,
the people who are at high risk are people who are obese, who have type 2 diabetes, have heart diseases, and of course, when people who have immunodeficiencies, they also are at high risk. But the most common problems are the cardiometabolic conditions, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases.
How could we protect them and us from them? During a time of virus.
We don't need to protect us from the people who are vulnerable. It's the other way around. Maybe I should start a bit earlier. with every respiratory virus disease, we know that the disease ends when we have herd immunity, when more than 60, 70% of people have become immune. And then if somebody becomes infectious again, he wouldn't find enough other people to infect at least one other person. And if somebody who is infectious cannot make another person infectious, then the disease is over.
So you're suggesting that possibly 60% of the population gets the virus in some form or another to develop this immunity?
Yes. About 60, 70%, something in that order of magnitude, should become infected and develop immunity. The majority of those, if they are young and healthy, will have no phenotype, will not even recognize that they are infected, and they may have a very mild disease. So they have the typical flu for a day or two, and then they are fine.
Or a cold, perhaps?
Or a cold, yeah. We have many colds that we have are actually coronavirus infections.
Interesting.
So we have to get to the point where we have herd immunity. And the only challenge is to make sure that the vulnerable, those who have obesity, type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis, and immune diseases, that those people are protected, that they are being isolated while the virus is spreading among everybody else. And then if 60% of the population are infected, then everybody can come together again and the whole thing is over. And we have that every year a few times. In 2019, 2020, we had 3 different epidemics. The first was influenza B, the second was influenza A, and the third was COVID. And Robert Redfield, on April the 17th, 2020, presented that data in the White House, and we have somewhere, I have shown the picture that I put here somewhere.
Would you please bring up the first slide?
So, we had 3 epidemics. And Robert Redfield, on April the 17th, 2020, presented the data at the White House. And as you can see, the red curve is the curve of that flu season. There was a peak early on, end of December. Then there was something that was a bit wider. That was in early February. And then in March, there was a third peak. Now, the first was influenza B, the second was influenza A, and the third was COVID.
And this was a year, what year, 2020?
2020. So this was 2020, very early on in the epidemic. And when he presented that in April 2020, on the 17th, you see that the number of people showing up in hospitals with influenza-like illnesses was already down at baseline. So the epidemic was essentially over in April the 17th. And this was not somebody telling things he doesn't understand about. This was Robert Redfield, the director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention.
And what happened next?
What happened next is something that was never, at least to my knowledge, explained. The lockdowns continued.
Weren't they supposed to end?
They were supposed to end after 3 or 4 weeks. They started end of March, and they could have ended end of April, because, as Robert Redfield showed, the epidemic was essentially over.
And they continued doing lockdowns. And
well, the lockdowns have 2 side effects. Like every intervention, they don't do what you want. They also do a couple of other things. So lockdowns flatten the curve, if that should be necessary, which turned out to not to be necessary, because we didn't need the tents in Central Park, we didn't need the hospital ship, we didn't need the 2,000 beds in the Javits Center in New York, the epicenter of the epidemic. All of that was not needed. The hospitals had a bit of stress, were full, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. So, but it was understandable that people were concerned after what they had seen in Italy. But on April the 17th, we knew that there was no need anymore to do anything other than protecting the vulnerable, which unfortunately wasn't done. But other than that, there was nothing that needed to be done anymore. And then we would have avoided the side effects of lockdowns. The first side effect is that we want to protect the vulnerable. So the vulnerable should wear masks. The vulnerable should wear to self-distance to make sure that they don't get infected while the virus is spreading among everybody else. However, if everybody else does exactly the same thing as the vulnerable, the vulnerable don't have an advantage anymore. And then the virus spreads among the vulnerable as much as among everybody else. That's not what we want. But if we have lockdowns, many more of the vulnerable get infected. And because they are at risk of dying, we have many more deaths. That is the first downside of lockdowns. Lockdowns are not protecting people. Lockdowns are maybe at some point in time protecting hospitals, but they are causing more people to die. And when the lockdowns last long, many more people. Because
the family, immediate family, is wearing the mask, they have caught the virus, and they're transmitting it to the elderly and the vulnerable?
No, the whole idea of personalizing this is not what you need for an epidemic. The families are not the drivers of epidemics.
Yes.
It is more we have to look at the population as a whole. We want the vulnerable people, those who are old and have comorbidities, and those who have immune deficiencies. These people need to be protected, and they need to be assisted in protecting themselves, staying away from other people and wearing a mask, letting food being delivered, not going out for the 3, 4, 5 weeks an epidemic lasts, while everybody else gets infected, just lives a normal life. This is something that people like myself and others published in March 2020. We should isolate the nursing homes. And we should keep the economy and the schools open. Unfortunately, this was misunderstood. What the politicians did is they shut down the schools and the economy and left the nursing homes open. So they did exactly the opposite of what epidemiologists would have told them if they had listened. So we were talking about the first problem with lockdowns. It is more people are dying among the vulnerable. The second problem is if you flatten the curve, it goes wider. It takes more time.
And what happens?
And if an epidemic has more time, the viruses have more time to acquire successive mutation, one after the other, each in a different person, until there is a new virus strain that is resistant to all the antibodies humans have developed. So herd immunity doesn't work anymore against this new virus, and we have the next epidemic, or wave, or whatever you call it. So the lockdowns are incubating new waves of new viruses. It is not that we may have the same disease because the phenotype is the same. The symptoms are the same. But it's caused by very different viruses. And later these viruses were called alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Omicron, all of these were all different viruses that were incubated by the lockdowns. Without the lockdowns, we wouldn't have had these viruses, because if a virus stays in a population only for 4, 5, 6 weeks, then there is not enough time for the virus to develop escape mutations and become resistant, and then have a new strain that spreads again.
Is there any protocol that would best help protect the elderly, those people specifically who have obesity, diabetes, et cetera, anything like?
Well, people who are at high risk know that, and
besides isolation.
What we could do is, there are nutritional strategies that people could use to reduce their risk. And if they're reducing their risk, we have much fewer deaths. There is something that is well known. For instance, if you don't have enough vitamin D, making sure you have enough vitamin D and some other vitamins is a good idea. That does not mean that you should eat vitamin D by the pound. That is not good either. Just enough is what's needed. More doesn't help more. The other thing is, there are other nutritional components that can be used. One of them are medium-chain fatty acids, like MCT oil, that is known to help to give additional protection from various from obesity, atherosclerosis, and type 2 diabetes. And there is something else. It's called alpha-cyclodextrin, another natural product that in Europe is approved to be taken to reduce particular forms of pre-diabetic conditions.
Is that a prescription? A thing that's done by prescription, or is it over the counter?
No. MCT oil and alpha-cyclodextrin are, and vitamin D, and vitamin A or E or whatever you want to take, they are all nutritional components that everybody can take, and to some extent reduce the severity of a disease when it develops. The FDA doesn't like that language, but they have to be a bit careful not to go overboard.
Would you call them supplements?
We call them supplements, and we can make function claims, and we can, so that we can say they improve certain functions where that may indirectly help with some diseases. And if I'm not going too far, the FDA was probably not going to kill me. But you should not advertise this as a miracle cure. That is something that would not be acceptable and would not be reasonable.
Yeah.
And then one could work on this, and that is something where I have done some work, and my company. So we have tried to improve the function of capric acid and alpha-cyclodextrin to make sure that they stick together and reach the intestinal wall together, because then they can have synergisms. The alpha-cyclodextrin emulsifies the capric acid, and the capric acid allows the alpha-cyclodextrin to be absorbed from the intestine to a larger extent, and then be more effective when it gets into the bloodstream. So one can do the natural thing, and one can also improve the natural functions a bit.
Which helps to support the system, the body system.
Yes. The idea is to help the body to heal itself, because what I mentioned earlier on, the problem with these diseases are not that the virus itself is killing us. We could live with this virus pretty easily. The problem is that eventually when the immune system has antibodies, the immune system kills all infected cells at the same time, and that creates a huge wound, especially in our lung. When many cells in our lung are infected and are being killed, then we have a wound, and that needs to heal. And if we have conditions where the healing is impaired, then we have a problem. So if we help our body to improve the healing function, then we have helped the body a lot, and we may have reduced the severity of the phenotype, and if we're reducing the severity of the phenotype, we are less likely to die of the disease. Any of those. So that would work not only with coronaviruses, that would also work with influenza viruses and rhinoviruses, and if somebody comes up with a new virus that also causes a respiratory virus disease, then it would probably work there as well.
Or the so-called common cold. Did the broad-based vaccinations and other focuses that make the most sense due to the exposure of the general population to the elderly and the general population to itself? Why or why not?
Okay, the people who are likely to have severe symptoms, like those who are old and vulnerable, have comorbidities, they would benefit the most from vaccination. At the other end, children benefit very little. In fact, vaccinating children could also be counterproductive.
Continue.
It wouldn't hurt the children, but it would slow down the spread among the children. And if we're slowing down the spread among the children, there is more opportunity for the virus to spread among the vulnerable. So, as I said that early on, we want to protect the vulnerable and have the virus spread among those who are not so vulnerable. That is the strategy to reduce the number of people dying during the epidemic and to prevent the next epidemic from becoming incubated. If we are mitigating, and that could be lockdowns, that could be masking, that could be distancing, that could be vaccinating the children, then we are flattening the curve. And flattening the curve increases the number of people dying and increases the risk of a new variant emerging.
Because it gives the virus time to change its characteristics. Or
these viruses mutate a lot. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's important to make sure that herd immunity develops fast. That herd immunity develops before the virus has enough time to go through all of these mutations and become resistant.
Was the timing a good idea, the timing that they used for vaccinations?
Vaccination against respiratory virus diseases is always too late. Because an epidemic typically lasts only for a couple of weeks. In a large country, it can be maybe a month or two. But that is not enough time to develop a vaccine against that virus. And that's why the influenza vaccines are only marginally efficient, if at all. Because we don't, at the time where the vaccine is produced, we don't know what the next virus is going to be. And here, we have a situation that is maybe even worse, because the next virus evolved to be resistant against immunity against the previous virus.
For which they have developed the vaccine.
And that includes immunity conveyed by vaccines.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Witkowski. What would you like our audience to take away with them?
I think that people should actually listen to qualified epidemiologists, and that is often epidemiologists who are not funded by the government, either with salary or with grant money.
Why is that?
Well, professors, now I'm simplifying again, don't have a salary anymore at the university. They have to write grants all the time, and many of these grants in this field come from the NIH. So professors have to make sure that they don't say anything the NIH might not like, or some people at the NIH might not like, because then they would run the risk that they are not getting their grant money anymore, and then they have no salary anymore. So they have to make very sure that they say what the government or the NIH want them to say. And so we hear people using the same words over and over again, and if different scientists are using the same language, it's always a sign that it's not something that they had been thinking about themselves, that they are adapting a certain language that they feel they have to use to make sure that they get their next grant funded.
And for people to protect themselves, what do you think that they should do?
They should lose weight.
They should lose weight, yes.
That they don't improve their type 2 diabetes. They improve their cardiovascular function. And there are many ways of doing this. One way is to fast. Intermittent fasting is something that has been shown to be effective in all of these diseases, and include also reducing the severity of coronavirus infections. Either you, day to day, you are not eating for 14 hours, or you do what many religions advise, and that is to fast for 2 days a week.
I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Until the next time, this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.